Peter Dutton and the Liberals showed us a masterclass in how to lose an election in 2025. But not content with showing us losing 101, they're now going to follow up with losing 102. The latest case in point is their stance on banning people under 16 years old from accessing social media, specifically banning them from accessing YouTube. The Australian reports that the opposition, so the Liberals, are calling on Labor to include YouTube in its world-leading social media ban for under 16-year-olds. Now, I want to stop there and say world-leading is not a good thing. Being the only country banning people from accessing social media is not a good outcome. Nevertheless, it continues on. The video streaming giant was initially said to be exempt, with the Albanese government arguing it could be educational. But the online watchdog has since advised YouTube it should be included. Opposition communication spokeswoman Melissa McIntosh said on Sunday that she agreed. Once again, we're going back to government policies and failures when it comes to protecting Australian children. The government decided to put forward legislation after a lot of pushing from the coalition and advocacy groups. But there's an exemption for YouTube. Why? Why is that? The eSafety Commissioner Julie Enman-Grant said last month that she warned kids were using YouTube more than any other social media platform. She said it was also causing the most harm to kids online. It's almost ubiquitous that kids are on social media, she said at the time, also speaking to the ABC. By far the most prevalent social media site they're on is YouTube. And when we're asked where they were experiencing harm and the kinds of harms they were experiencing, the most prevalent place where young Australians experienced harm was on YouTube, almost 37%. This ranges from misogynistic content to hateful material to violent fighting videos, online challenges, disordered eating, and suicidal ideation. I want to stop there and note that the devil is in the detail. After all, when they're saying that 37% of young Australians say they're getting harm from YouTube, well, where was that survey done? What was the quality of that survey? Who exactly did they ask? Was this actually biased by self-selection bias? Was it biased by whoever they chose? That number of 37% could be completely meaningless, as like the old adage, lies, lies, and damn statistics. Furthermore, when they're talking about harms, online challenges is one of the harms they talk about. Violent fighting videos is another harm. Does that include things like MMA or boxing? Or what about hateful material? What is hateful material? Is that material they happen to disagree with? Is it material that they happen to have from a different side of the political aisle? How is that being defined? In essence, you've got a survey number that is potentially completely meaningless and a definition of harmful material that is also so broad and nebulous that it is also completely meaningless. In essence, lies, lies, and damn statistics. In her remarks on Sunday, Ms. McIntosh called on the Albanese government to heed Ms. Enman-Grant's advice, including making YouTube in the ban. Quote, "It's a logical thing to do. What makes it complex is when there's some platforms that are out there and there's some that are in. If that's going to be the case, it needs to be clear to Australian families why that's the case. Because once again, it's our Australian kids that we need protecting first and foremost. Again, won't someone think of the children?" So in essence, the Libs, not content with losing in 2025, which was in part because they had retreated from being liberal in any description, they're now following this up. Part of the reason they lost in 2025 was they had no clear message, and the message wasn't appealing. The Liberals needed to stand for being the party of aspiration and less government control in your life. They need to stand for the party of freedom. Now, not necessarily to the extreme of the Libertarians, because the Libertarians have cornered that market, and there's only so far that can go. But perhaps the party of, I'll call it sensible libertarianism, or sensible liberalism. The party of getting the government largely out of your business, albeit with some sensible limits. The party where the government does as little as possible, but still does some things that generally are well accepted. The party that doesn't really try to control what you are watching online. And the party that stands for aspiration and individual liberty. The party that stands for letting you get ahead, keeping more of your own money. That's what they need to stand for. But they don't. And this is why I supported Tim Wilson to be Liberal Party leader, and there are some other members of the Liberal Party I think are actually quite good. But it's also why I think Susan Lee and Angus Taylor and the people that were behind the old mob probably shouldn't be lionized and put in positions of power. Now, to be clear, I do still think that Susan Lee is significantly less trash than Anthony Albanese, but being less trash is not a compelling proposition. And I think going all in on this under 16-year-old social media ban is not the way to do it. Let's face it, say for example you were to look at YouTube. Let's just do a basic Google search for how to paint a door. The first result is from Bunnings, and lo and behold, Bunnings has a YouTube video on how to paint a door. And I dare say people under 16 years old might Google something similar. How to paint a door, how to paint a window frame, etc, etc, etc. What about if that person under 16 years old is at school and they're looking at differentiation and they Google how to differentiate? Well, on the first page of results, we've got YouTube videos. And YouTube videos from places like Starfish Maths or the Organic Chemistry Tutor. Videos that look rather educational to me, and they're the types of videos you would think that people should get access to. YouTube isn't just for dangerous fighting videos or misogynistic content, as has been asserted. YouTube has myriad types of content. Banning people who are under 16 years old from YouTube makes no sense. As I said in my prior video on this type of thing, where I mentioned Julian Munn Grant and her push to ban YouTube, YouTube is not like Twitter or X, it's not like Facebook, it's not like Snapchat, it's not like any of those other platforms. And all of those other platforms, one engages in more of a conversation, where there's a back and forth between two people. On something like YouTube, there's less of a direct conversation. People might comment on a video, but in reality, if you look at the comments, people are typically engaging with each other less than they are on something like a Twitter/X. And therefore, YouTube is objectively very different from the other platforms. Furthermore, YouTube is different from a platform like TikTok, in large part because of the ownership structure. Let's face it, TikTok has this slightly opaque ownership structure that has raised some concerns about the nature of the algorithm. Furthermore, TikTok notoriously has a little bit more brain rot, although that could easily filter onto YouTube, so there's not necessarily a hard line between the two there. In addition, TikTok seemingly is a little bit more social in terms of its content, in terms of the interaction between videos, with people cutting and editing other people's videos and the like. And what this means is that we shouldn't just treat all social media platforms as being the same, and we shouldn't just put them all into one type of ban, because it doesn't make any sense. But we see this same one-size-fits-all rule in myriad other government policies. For example, let's just take the EV emissions hurdles. Well, the government wants to penalize cars or car companies for manufacturing and producing and selling cars that generate too much carbon dioxide. However, they fail to consider the average kilometers driven by a buyer of those cars. Let's take an example. Suppose someone buys a supercar with a large engine. I dare say that he or she is probably not driving that car very far, because typically supercars don't have very many kilometers on them. And this means they're often there for decoration to some extent, but also going for periodic or infrequent events. So maybe a meetup with some other friends, rather than being driven daily. And therefore you wonder, well, does that car really produce that much pollution? Does it add that much carbon dioxide to the atmosphere relative to some other cars? And you therefore think this one-size-fits-all approach, when the car is not being used so much as a car, doesn't necessarily make that much sense. But the government seems to go down this rabbit hole of ever more control. Now, of course, whether or not the government caves on YouTube remains to be seen. I suspect they probably will, but I also suspect that a lot of people are going to be unhappy with this ban. I also think that the coalition should have just left the issue alone. There are no votes in advocating for YouTube to be restricted ever more. There is no world in which the coalition is going to pick up more votes, either from teal voters or from more liberty-minded people, because of pushing for ever more government control. It's anathema to what they should be standing for. The Labour Party is effectively the party of more government intervention. The coalition should be the party of aspiration. Unfortunately, they don't appear to have learnt that lesson. But until that happens, it looks like the Libs are going to keep shooting themselves in the foot. Nevertheless, let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below.